When a millionaire landlord stormed to collect late rent, he expected excuses, but instead, he found a little black girl sewing with trembling hands, fighting sleep and hunger, and what he did next left everyone speechless. The sun was dipping low behind the horizon as a luxury SUV pulled up in front of a rundown apartment complex. It stood in stark contrast to the sleek vehicle, with chipped paint on the walls and weeds pushing through the cracks in the pavement. This building was one of many properties under the ownership of one of the city's wealthiest men, a self-made millionaire known for his sharp business instincts and zero tolerance for late payments. He had received multiple notifications about a tenant who was now 2 months behind on rent. Ignoring his assistant's offer to send someone else, he chose to handle this matter personally. It was supposed to be a quick visit, a warning, perhaps an eviction notice. Nothing more. Business was business, after all. He climbed the creaky steps, his polished shoes tapping against worn-out wood. The air smelled faintly of old cooking oil and dust. His expensive cologne clashed sharply with the heavy stillness that hung in the narrow hallway. Apartment 3B. That was the one. He raised his hand and knocked hard. 3 firm, authoritative raps that echoed like a gavel through the corridor. There was a pause, then the sound of rustling. Finally, the door creaked open. A tired woman, maybe in her late 30s, stood behind it. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw him, and a flicker of panic crossed her face. She looked like she hadn't slept in days. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and her shirt was stained with what looked like fabric chalk and thread. Behind her, the small apartment was dimly lit, shadows dancing across the peeling wallpaper. Before she could speak, a small movement caught the millionaire's eye. In the corner of the room, barely illuminated by a flickering table lamp, was a young black girl. She couldn't have been older than 9 or 10. She sat cross-legged on the floor, hunched over a piece of cloth. Her small hands were busy stitching, the needle moving in a rhythm far too practiced for someone her age. Next to her were piles of old clothes, some torn, others half-mended. Her eyes drooped with exhaustion, but she kept sewing, blinking back sleep. There was no television, no tablet, not even a proper desk. Just a thin mattress on the floor, scattered sewing supplies, and silence thick enough to choke on. The woman quickly apologized, her voice soft and cracking. She explained that things had been hard since her husband passed away 6 months ago. He'd been their sole provider. Now she cleaned houses during the day, and her daughter helped her at night by mending old clothes they collected from donation bins and trying to resell them. It wasn't much, but it kept the lights on, barely. Rent, however, had fallen behind. The millionaire didn't respond right away. He simply stared at the girl, watching her needle weave in and out of the fabric like second nature. Her hands trembled slightly from fatigue, but she didn't stop. Every so often, she'd pause to squint at a crooked stitch and carefully undo it, her tiny brow furrowed in frustration. She was fighting sleep, fighting hunger, and perhaps fighting fear. Fear that her small hands weren't working fast enough to save her home. The room was quiet, save for the faint hum of traffic outside and the soft scratch of thread pulling through fabric. Something in the millionaire's chest tightened. He had seen a lot in his rise to the top: contracts, boardrooms, bankruptcies, but he hadn't seen this in a long time. Not up close. Not like this. The woman continued talking, now rambling nervously, offering to pay half the rent this Friday, maybe the rest by next week. Her voice trembled, but not with anger, with shame. She wasn't begging. She was trying to uphold her dignity, trying to shield her daughter from humiliation. But the girl was listening. And even though she kept her head down, her shoulders had stiffened. She understood what was at stake. She was sewing not just to help her mother, but to help her survive. The millionaire finally cleared his throat, but the words he had prepared never made it past his lips. The usual script about consequences, responsibilities, contracts. It suddenly felt small, even cruel, in the face of what he'd just witnessed. He looked around the tiny space again. No toys, no decorations, just survival stitched into every inch of fabric piled up in the corner. This wasn't the visit he had planned. He had come for money, but instead, he found something far more valuable. Something that stirred a part of him he hadn't felt in years. He left without saying much. No threats, no paper served. just a quiet nod. The mother looked confused, but she didn't question it. The girl, still sewing, looked up briefly, eyes meeting his. For a second, neither blinked. Then he turned and walked back down the stairs, but not the same man who had walked up them just minutes earlier. The cold silence in the car matched the storm quietly unraveling inside his mind. What should have been routine business errand had instead become a confrontation with something he'd buried deep, memories he hadn't touched in years. The little girl's weary hands, her stitched fingers moving through thread and cloth, kept replaying his mind like a record stuck on repeat. He remembered being her once, not in the same skin or body, but in spirit, a child working when the world should have let him be one. He hadn't had a needle and thread. He had a stack of newspapers at dawn and heavy groceries after school. His mother had scrubbed floors in hospitals and cooked in diners. His father had walked out before he was born. No inheritance, no connections, just long nights, unpaid bills, and the unrelenting pressure to grow up faster than anyone should have to. Success hadn't come easily. It had been carved out of suffering, shaped by rejection, and hardened by the unforgiving grind of survival. He had clawed his way up from food stamps to finance, from eviction notices to empire, and in doing so he had made a vow. He would never be poor again. He would never look back. But looking at that little girl, sewing with exhaustion written across her face, he realized he had kept that vow too well. He hadn't just left poverty behind. He had erased it from his identity. He had become the very kind of man who wouldn't have had time for the child he once was. Meanwhile, that mother and daughter lived on the edge of collapse. The woman had once worked at a beauty salon. She lost her job during the pandemic when the owner shut down. Her husband, a delivery driver, had gotten sick with pneumonia and never recovered. Since then, life had become a series of hard decisions: buying medicine or paying rent, feeding her child or keeping the lights on. There was no support system, no savings, just grit. And the daughter, bright and once full of dreams, had changed overnight. She used to come home with drawings, with stories about becoming a designer. Now she came home to torn shirts, hand-me-downs, and the quiet pressure of watching her mother fall apart slowly, one unpaid bill at a time. The sewing had started as a distraction, something to pass the time. But then the mother found out that thrift stores would buy mended clothes by the pound. Not for much, but just enough. The girl picked it up fast. Her stitches were cleaner than her mother's. Faster, too. But it wasn't talent that motivated her. It was necessity. The landlord had never meant to forget what that felt like. But wealth changes things. It doesn't just cushion your life. It muffles the cries you once knew by heart. The boardrooms he sat in didn't talk about single mothers. The dinner parties he attended didn't serve people who skipped meals to make rent. He had created a life so far removed from struggle that seeing it again felt like a punch to the gut. And yet, deep down, he recognized it. Not just the poverty, but the pride. That fierce, quiet pride in the mother's voice as she explained how they were managing, even though it was clear they weren't. The girl never asked for sympathy. She kept sewing. That was her answer to every hardship. Work harder, be useful. Stay awake a little longer. He had once been praised for those same traits. When he was young and broke, people admired his hustle, his drive, his ambition. But when that same spirit lived in a little black girl, tucked into a forgotten apartment with unpaid rent, no one called it promise. No one came offering opportunity. They came with deadlines, with notices, with judgments. And now he realized he had almost done the same. Had he walked in just a few minutes earlier or left without noticing her in the corner, he would have handed that family a final warning, maybe even a lock change, all while carrying a watch worth more than their yearly income. His empire had taught him to be efficient, strategic, detached. But no amount of money could insulate the truth he saw in that apartment. The child's hands weren't just tired. They were telling a story of love, sacrifice, and survival. A story society often overlooks, or worse, punishes. He had once told himself that anyone could make it if they worked hard enough. But what he saw in that dim apartment cracked that belief wide open. Some people weren't failing. They were drowning, and no one had ever thrown them a rope. They weren't lazy. They were exhausted. And sometimes, the only difference between a millionaire and a little girl stitching shirts was a single chance. And for the first time in years, he asked himself a question he wasn't prepared to answer. Had he forgotten what it meant to be human? The days following the visit weighed heavily on his mind. The world around him, meetings, investments, negotiations, continued at its usual relentless pace. But something inside him had shifted. The image of the girl hunched over the torn fabric, silently battling fatigue with every stitch, refused to leave him. It haunted his thoughts like an unfinished sentence. And for the first time in years, he found himself listening to a part of his conscience he had long ignored. He had built his empire on precision, speed, and profit. Every square foot of property had been measured against ROI. Every decision filtered through spreadsheets and projections. But no metric could quantify what he felt standing in that dim apartment. It wasn't just pity, it was recognition. And with recognition came responsibility. Instead of sending a final notice, he called his legal team. He asked questions they weren't used to hearing. How could rent be forgiven without damaging the lease terms? What would it take to transfer ownership of part of the building to a nonprofit initiative? Could a unit be converted into a community space? The team was confused but complied. He wasn't asking for opinions. He was making decisions. He visited the property again, this time not in silence, but with intention. He brought contractors, designers, and an interior consultant. He gave instructions to renovate the apartment, not just patch the cracks, but transform it. A new mattress, proper lighting, a real sewing table, shelves, and even a small desk with school supplies. Not a luxury makeover, but a space fit for living, not just surviving. But the changes didn't stop there. He purchased 3 sewing machines, industrial grade, and had them delivered to the building. Then he reached out to a friend who ran a nonprofit fashion incubator. Together, they created a plan to turn the apartment's spare room into a mini workshop, a place where the mother and daughter could repair and resell clothes as a legitimate business. He helped them register the business under the daughter's name, setting up a savings account in her name that would collect a portion of all profits. The mother tried to protest, overwhelmed by the generosity, but he stopped her. This wasn't charity, he explained. It was investment in talent, in resilience, in a child who had done more with thread and torn cloth than most people did with privilege and comfort. Word spread slowly through the neighborhood. The millionaire who once sent eviction notices had started something unusual. Other tenants, inspired by what they saw, began to share their skills too. One offered to teach bookkeeping. Another donated fabric. What had begun as a rent collection visit turned into the quiet birth of community micro-business, stitched together by empathy and opportunity. The girl, once too tired to smile, began to change. Her hands still worked, but now with purpose, not fear. Her mother enrolled her back into school. A tutor came in twice a week, paid for through a new educational fund the millionaire had quietly established for tenants' children. He didn't want publicity. He declined interviews. This wasn't a story for headlines. It was a commitment to redemption, both theirs and his own. He began reviewing his other properties. Units once labeled low yield became opportunities for transformation. He instructed his team to prioritize tenant stories, not just credit reports. New guidelines were drafted for identifying families in need, not for eviction, but for support. He partnered with nonprofits to create rent assistance pathways, educational scholarships, and startup funds for tenant-led initiatives. Some investors questioned his methods. Why shift focus from profitability? Why complicate a model that had made him millions? But he knew the answer. Because profit without purpose had almost turned him into the kind of man he once feared becoming. Numb, detached, transactional. He had once believed success meant never looking back. But now he understood that looking back wasn't weakness. It was the compass for moving forward. The girl in apartment 3B didn't need saving. She needed someone to see her, to believe in her, to open a door that had always been locked. In helping her, he had rediscovered the parts of himself he thought he had outgrown. The scrappy boy with tired hands and impossible dreams. The one who once needed a break, and had found none. This time, he decided, the story would end differently. And so, one stitch at a time, something new was woven into the fabric of his legacy. Not just wealth, but worth. Not just growth, but grace. And in that humble apartment, where a child once sewed through her exhaustion, a future brighter than thread and stronger than sorrow had finally begun.